Hello and welcome everyone today. Thank you for joining us. Just letting a few more people starting to join, a few more people trickling in at the moment. So I just want to start with the welcome. So today we have got our first virtual event of our virtual series based on the book we released end of last year, which is Create, Deliver and Maintain the External Envelope Vision. Today we will be discussing the first chapter of that book, Creating a Successful Vision. Joining us today, other than myself, who's the events manager for ResiBuild, we have Brendan Geraghty, he's director at Centred Architecture, David Jones, Director of Education and Training at the Institute of Construction Management. We have Tom Hall with us today, he's the Chief Economist for Barber ABI and AMA Research Limited. Nick Horton, who's the Head of Marketing at Sapphire Balconies, Richard Fairhead, Head of Residential at 3D Reed Limited, and Ernie Bardwick, who's Director at E8 Design. With several questions that have already been set for those that have watched the pre-recorded interviews this week. If you haven't had a chance to watch all of the pre-recorded interviews, don't worry, they will be available after the events. You can go back and watch in your own time. If you have any other questions for the panel, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom there of Zoom, and we'll try to get to some of those questions as well. Any questions that we don't manage to get to, I will be sending out to the panel and hopefully they'll be able to give us some feedback. Once I get that, I will add that to the event page. So again, if you go back and view, then you can see the results there. Like I say, if you have any questions, please do input them to the Q&A section. And again, thank you to everyone for joining us. I'd like to start off with one of our first questions. So this one would be for, it was mentioned in the build to rent market was able to adjust well to the renters' needs. How do these buildings differ from the build to buy? So were they able to adjust as well? So I'm not sure who'd like to start with that one.
I'm happy to kick off.
Lovely, thank you, Brendan.
I think the fundamental difference between a built-to-rent building and a built-for-sales building is the ownership. It is a single ownership, single landlord, and that really gives that makes for a much easier management of that block than a multiple ownership. That's the principal difference. From a design perspective, a significant difference will be the level of amenity space offered. So there will be, in addition to the private apartments or increasingly now housing estates, there will be shared amenity offered to the residents, which may be a gym or some sort of flexible space or workspace, and there will be a back of house function providing services, and there will always be a very strong technology infrastructure. So Wi-Fi and access to high-speed internet will be a cornerstone of a built-to-rent building. There are other differences, but I would say that those are the principal differences between a build-for-sale and a build-to-rent. Perhaps one more is that the asset is not designed to be sold to multiple people. It's really going to be traded through investors and at an institutional level, and the asset will trade in itself. So therefore the specification is different to a sales specification in terms of that whole life costing, and those sorts of things will play a much greater part in the design process.
Thank you very much. Did anyone else have any other experiences they'd like to add to that one before I move on? Okay, so the next question that I have for the panel, I think this was for you, Richard. Do you think that inner city developments will have a change of requirements, or will it start to attract a different buyer renter? I believe, like you mentioned in your interview, about more like older residential homes being more inner city. Do you think there's going to be a change?
I think I said I'd like to live in some of the developments. Yeah. They're never always designed for me. I think when build to rent kicked off, there was a big focus on mix and demographic and focusing in on particular age groups that were disenfranchised with purchasing houses and everything else and looking for a different way of life in terms of renting. I think we've designed a number of age-focused build-to-rent buildings, which, you know, at the outset is always a good aspiration for the start of the market. But I don't believe that when it's actually been rented that it's ever fulfilled the full aspiration of demographic and mix. And, you know, I think as designers, we're trying to create communities in build-to-rent buildings. So we're trying to create a longer dwell time, the ability for people to move between different apartment blocks, but stay within the realms of the landlord. So obviously they benefit out of that. And it's quite difficult to create a community with one age group and demographic. I think what we need is a mix of demographic and a mix of ages to create that feeling of community. And I think we should be more focused on that now, you know, helping each other, coming out of the pandemic, all that sort of stuff, that, you know, the full range of people living in a single building or a number of buildings in one location will work, I think, for a better environment for everyone. So yeah, I think it will change, I think, away from fixed demographics overall.
Thank you, Richard. Tom, did you have anything you'd like to add to that one? I saw you kind of agreeing with him there. So.
Well, just wise words. I think from Richard, I guess it's not so much a comment, I guess just a question to the rest of the panel, probably, in terms of, I guess, what do you guys as kind of on the more planning side of things think need to change to facilitate that? Because I mean, well, I'm heavily into the data and, you know, planning environments and stuff. I don't see the change of use coming through in any great amounts yet, as it were. There's obviously a lot of kind of inner city development going on, which is good at the moment. But yeah, I just kind of, you know, structurally, culturally, legislation wise, what are the blockers?
Can I just comment as well, please? I mean, just to pick up on some of Richard's points first, I think demographics and build to rent are a bit of a, as Richard has said, is a bit of a misnomer. It's a difficult one. It's really about behaviors and values. And in that sense, that's where build to rent is really embracing the consumer culture and customer centricity. So it's not so much about, am I in this age group, but do I value these things? Do I behave in this way? And then design towards that. Now, residential development has a massive influence of sales culture, which does not operate on those terms. So to that extent, we're closer to the commercial office market or even the retail market in terms of how we view our customers than we are to the traditional the traditional housing market. But to your point, Tom, on how we're seeing things change, I think we're going to see. I think build to rent is pioneering new initiatives within residential real estate. Consumer centricity or consumer culture, I think, is certainly coming in. We're seeing a lot more focus around sort of brand before building. What is the hardware and the hardware offer to the customer, and then letting that inform the building. Things like customer acquisition and customer retention strategies are important, because whilst the asset has its own physical value, the thing that drives build to rent and drives rents are your customer acquisition and retention. And if you look at the institutional markets, which is the ultimate market, or for many will be the ultimate market, they are, of course, attracted to the asset value in terms of the physical asset, but they are attracted to the stable revenue, even at a lower yield. So it's a paradigm shift for residential real estate, and it's for the first time really having to look at consumers and what consumers want. And to your point of what's going to change, I mean, I think, unfortunately, if something is not baked in at planning, it generally does not get in. And most planning applications are submitted with about 35 to 40% of the required information. That is going to have to change, and is already changing. The building safety bill and fire bills will be having an influence there. But equally, if we're going to design and for a service-based residential offer, we are going to have to bake more things in at planning than we are at the moment. And that's where we're going to see a lot of shifts coming. And I mean, I could give examples around, internet, digital infrastructure, whole life costings, and where these things are starting to be expected or desired by investors and slowly are trickling into the design process.
Brendan, can I add that I spent nearly 12 months creating a brand for someone else with regards to build to rent, even though they already had a number of some 800 properties. And one of the interesting things was that they started looking at sites, city centre, with a view that they didn't have to provide the amenity space because they were going to take advantage of the local community amenities, as there may be a gym 500 yards down the road and so forth. So they were actually looking wider at a community, whereas some of the West London build to rent estates at the moment, I tend to believe that they've gone for a certain demographic and they've pushed those. They're quite inward looking communities because they only mixed within themselves. And I think as planners move forward, they are going to try and force this sort of drive to make these spaces, because they're not small developments, are they? They could be up from 50 to 200 units.
I think the flip side of that is, finding space within the development for community use, wider community use, as well as flexible space. So I think gone are the days where our briefs are prescriptive about the type and use of space. Everyone can have a gym, but actually if you have a room with the loadings to take free weights, you can have a yoga room, you can have Pilates, you can have all sorts of functions going on in that. And I think, the ability for planners to understand we're just going to create space and not name it or give it a use, and accept that it's going to work under the premise of the way the landlord will curate the space for not only its residents, but for the wider community. I think there's a bit of work to do on that, but I don't think there are any blockers other than, the fact that culturally and London as a city has shifted massively, and the likes of Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow, Edinburgh, which are all walkable cities, have actually adopted this a lot quicker. But as London becomes more and more multicultural, the idea of an Englishman's home is his castle is dwindling away. And as a nation, we're accepting the idea that renting is a different way of life, because we all want experiences as opposed to possessions and things like that. So there will be a massive shift that way, but I don't think there's anything barring it other than ourselves, really, and how we adopt it.
Interesting point that you made and started on early there. One of the things we noticed going back a few years ago, both in London and in Manchester and other areas as well, was a bit of a trend with the rental side of things to create space, designated space within the building as private amenity space, just put a Juliet balcony on the outside. But we've definitely seen that mindset move away as people realise with the kind of hindsight of lockdowns and so on, how actually getting that rental customer probably needs a proper balcony, not just designated space, which ultimately we all know will probably have a sofa on it, not be a designated space of open air within a building. But that's certainly something we've seen. We've seen a lot more balcony opportunities going around the UK more generally than what there perhaps may have been in the past.
Just coming on the vastness of the rental and build to rent market, the large blocks and the large balcony spaces, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there is a vast plethora of renters in HMOs and the small properties, and they're in our communities too, and they're sharing our spaces too. So some way, maybe we should look at a more holistic view of bringing the HMO tenants into more holistic sort of synergy with the large developments, and then the whole thing starts to make sense, you know, because we're hearing some horrendous problems with the landlords of HMOs and things like that, and the abuses in things like that. And of course, there's all these different levels of occupation. There's small estates and small things. The whole community needs to come together. And Nick, what you're saying about the balcony as being, you know my view on this, that the balcony is that space that links, it's a link between the inner space of all those vertical living internal spaces to the community space around us. It's so important. And you know, when the importance of that, what that balcony actually signifies, is that linking, it will then start to join up the communities as well, because they'll be able to look into, look out to, look down onto, and whatever, and see life going on, and see life in the high rise, the low rise. Will be able to and share these spaces, you know, what you're doing and what you're talking about, the design, and dare I say the planning. You know, you're saying what we've heard today, Brendan, what you were saying about this lack of front-end planning and the golden thread, and Tom, what you were saying, you know, what we've been finding with the construction industry is that there isn't much front-end planning. It just sort of starts, and you end up at the end of the construction phase with a health and safety file that says all the information's got to be there. And when you open that information, invariably it says this section's got to be filled in, this section is incomplete, I'm waiting, I'm waiting for this report to be done, I'm waiting for this certificate. So it's an absolute nonsense, and this is what CDM competence is all about. You know, if we can sort of reverse the situation and get planning and get it properly planned, and hopefully when the building safety bill goes through and it properly incorporates these the 3 gateways. We've already got the first gateway, which is the planning side for fire and things like that, but you know, we've got to really police this, make sure that the information is not just waved through like we've seen with at the Grenfell inquiry with the building control. He's a gatekeeper, you know, and all he was looking for was a BBA badge on some bit of badly written document that hadn't even looked at the content, and because it had a badge on it, he just opened the gate. You know, we've got to police this whole thing properly and bring the holistic view. That's could go on, but it's important, this front-end planning and making sure everything is there and carrying it through. You know, you often get 106 agreements, bit of front-end planning just to get it through planning, but when you actually review at the end of the job, has that 106 agreement been fulfilled? It tells a different story. You know, it's community.
Is it not the case? I mean, the thing is, I think I built to rent specifically because we started with that, but I think it's a broader point. I mean, it's a nascent industry. I mean, really, it's not even out of nappies, and as it grows, it's gonna, you know, it will be its own force. I don't think it will rival sales. I think sales will always be the dominant thing, but it's defining its own culture. They're making some mistakes, and some developments are more insular. But what is true is that community is what gives us you know, a sense of belonging, and that is a universal truth, and we will need to address that. But to your point on holism, I mean, I think that built to rent approaches its design and its proposition more holistically than any other residential offer, and I think that it will set a new standard in this regard. I think that there is not enough understanding of the cost of delivering good build to rent. And when you go into conversations around affordable housing and that type of thing, there isn't a consistent approach. The viability model is largely based on a for sale model, which doesn't really suit the build to rent approach. So there's a lot of things that need to be looked at and addressed to create a properly holistic approach. Certainly build to rent is not there yet, but it's certainly moving in that direction as quickly as it can. And you know, the point here really is when we come to the product, as you've described, and that kind of completeness of health and safety. Well, I think we need to move away from generic residential solutions. Build to Rent is starting to do that and come up with a specific offer, to Richard's point around, not demographics, but behaviors, and let that product define let that define the product. And then those other support materials will be much, much richer.
Yeah, good point.
It certainly is just one part of the offering, isn't it? When you're looking at a community, you just mentioned social housing, affordable housing, whatever you want to call it. That's another one that's got to be worked on, because I think there was an issue in the press a few years ago where a certain developer put a fence around a kid's playground, and it was an unintentional effect that the people that were within the social housing or the affordable felt that they were being excluded. Now, what's the word? Community. It should be everyone. And you guys in architecture, you're all, let's be honest, it's all about social engineering and making sure that everything that you draw or design is fit for that ultimate goal of enriching all of us. So I think whatever we go forward on, I think you're quite right, Brendan, and putting Build to Rent to one side, and there's a wider conversation going on now about the community, and probably the last 2 years has reinforced it. We all need open space. We all need to be able to mix and get out there and make sure that our own mental health and well-being is catered for. And if we don't start with design and we don't start at looking at the end game, that one of the part of that I wrote about was with regards to lifetime homes, whether, that is it's a string to a bow, but there's a lot more to do. Those 16 recommendations or what was it? I can't remember what the actual word was, but that's got to be expanded going forward. And what's going to happen? It's only, I think, the design industry that can do it. The planners, most local planning authorities are stretched. They haven't got enough people. They're asking people a lot of them are freelancing now. They're not really looking after the local population in many respects. Maybe I'm wrong, but from the experience I've had at South East London Council recently, I was dealing with a young Australian girl, and she great, but she should be on a boat back to home soon, she said.
It's interesting actually you mentioned that. We had a couple of questions. I think a couple of you there have mentioned like outside space and community. We've actually had a couple of questions relating to that. One of them was, Richard, you'd mentioned outside space and well-being in your interview. Do you think this is going to be a big consideration to renters of the future? And also, how important, the other question was, how important do you feel outside space is for future development? And will this be through balconies, or some developments you're seeing like the roof space for community use? Is this something that's going to be more, especially I say since lockdown and people have wanted that space, and it's become probably more a thought of aspect when looking at properties? How do you guys feel? Do you think it's going to be something that's definitely going to be more considered in the planning stage to make sure this is included?
I think it will be included in the brief more than anything else. I think, as Brendan said, the culture is changing, and the people that rent know how to vote with their feet. They have social media, they can comment on anything. I always joked 5 years ago about a site called Rate My Landlord, and I believe there actually is one now. I won't take any credit for it, but people can just walk and rent somewhere else. So I think, the landlords have to take stock of what people are what people's needs are now and what they will be in the future, and having as we've all seen from the pandemic, having somewhere to go that's outside the realms of the flat itself it is an absolute positive. To have it in the fresh air is even better, and to have the ability to then talk to someone different to who you see on a day-to-day basis, having to work, live and play in the same space constantly, it is a, you know, an absolute release for our mental health and our well-being. You know, there will be other factors like getting the appropriate amount of sunlight in, daylight in. The GLA's big push on dual aspect units is something relating to that in both ventilation and sunlight and daylight. But, you know, I think I read somewhere about pre-pandemic actually that that there were higher divorce rates in smaller units because people don't have anywhere to go. So, you know, a couple starting out in, or separation, you know, you've got a bedroom and a living room, that's it. You have an argument that one of you takes the bedroom and the other one has the living space. There's literally nowhere else to go. That can't be great for your mental health. And, you know, within the pandemic, a number of buildings that we've handed over that completed, the sales of one bed, sorry, the uptake of one bed apartments is considerably lower than the 2s and 3s. People would rather buy the extra space because they know the value of space now, having lived through the pandemic. And that's not about, you know, having more space to throw junk. It's about well-being. It's about, you know, having somewhere to go that isn't the same space, having some place to work at another table that isn't the kitchen table with 5 other people. And I think we're going to see a lot of that factor in, and it might increase space standards a little bit. You know, we might start to put home working spaces in. I mean, not that we shouldn't have them in anyway, but a specific space for going to work that's got daylight in it somehow. And I think space standards will increase to allow for that. But yeah, the well-being aspirations and agenda, I think we'll start to focus considerably now.
Richard,
yeah,
do you see social rent design changing much?
Unfortunately, social rent is all about the cost of building it rather than actually providing it in the appropriate way. Yes, it should, and yes, it should be driven by the standards. So of all the properties that we design, all the tenures we design for, the base level should really be the mark for affordable, and everything else should be, you know, if you can afford a different rent or a rate, that's fine. And I think that, you know, the space standards that we set for the smaller units are quite tight. I think we get to, you know, I always said, if you look at 4 car parking spaces next time you're at Sainsbury's, that's a 1-bed flat. You know, that is 50 square meters, that's it. And then you try and envisage putting everything you need to put into a 1-bed flat to live comfortably in 4 car parking spaces becomes quite a challenge.
Yes.
So
yes, because that 1-bed flat will soon be a 2-bed, 3-person, or sorry, a 2-person flat that will then suddenly become a 3-person flat.
Yes, yes.
And it's one of those things.
And I think that the way we live and how and the people that rent, as Brendan said earlier, you know, that will be defined by the uptake of people, not by people at the outset. And I think once we understand that more, we can start to shift the parameters of the way we focus on design for both affordable, for, you know, every tenure, I think, even sales. But that all comes down to build cost at the end of the day.
I think it's just build cost, Richard, but it's sorry, I have to pick up on this point, because the point you made that it's the designer's responsibility to sort this out, and I don't believe that it is. I think space standards can actually be a limitation to good design because they just become a tick box.
Correct.
But I think that, you know, where residential properties or homes fall down is when they're used in a way that they were not designed to be used. So a 1-bedroom flat that's got a 5-person family in it is where it's gone wrong. That's a macro supply and demand issue. So, you know, I think designers have a huge responsibility, and we must take that responsibility to design good homes. There's no question about that, and I take that on 100%. But the lack of supply in the UK is really at the root of a lot of the issues that we see played out in small apartments or houses having to house large populations. So we must separate these issues and address them appropriately. And I think the supply issue is a major problem that is plaguing this nation and will do for some time. And we need a diversity of product, which the designers can help with, but a diversity of product to solve that problem, and that will not necessarily be aided by minimum space standards as an absolute, because it is also potentially a disabler rather than an enabler.
Yeah, I think I meant in terms of the space standards, I think that was more not minimum, but a set of space standards that respond to our well-being needs and our peace of mind, as opposed to solving it. I mean, we can only work to the brief and challenge it as we get it. So there are it's a cultural shift in those that the landlords and the operators and the developers that need to take this on board just as much as space standards and the supply. And I think you're right. You know, we can have we can have different types of apartments that start to meet those demands, but again, they all need to, you know, meet a certain level of quality. Otherwise, no one will want to live in them, and we'll be creating ghettos of emptiness of properties because so and so down the road has got so much more to offer for the same money.
Richard, you spoke about GLA and the standards and requirements they specify and so on within London. Looking at the London requirements versus what the national standards are, particularly space, and particularly think a bit narrow, I suppose, with from a balcony point of view, there's requirements in London which just don't apply outside of the M25. Do you think there's more which needs to actually happen in that remit in terms of specifying? Because we're seeing in London people going above and beyond that, but certainly people working very closely to that. However, it does vary a massive amount around different parts of the UK. Although our kind of lifestyles don't change very much outside of the M25 to within the M25 to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think the difference in the GLA stuff is they ask you to have a balcony that you can use, whereas the national standards is just a space requirement. I think the GLA stipulates a depth of balcony so that you can get a table on it with some chairs or a turning circle for a wheelchair. But I think they're the only real requirements that they put on it, and you know that's something that can go to the back up to the space standards. But I think it's as much as but it's about the way people use the space that will drive the need for the balcony. And if you build a building that just has unusable space on it, you can just stand out on and not do a lot on and not partake of it, then people again will walk. They'll find something else that's got a bigger balcony on it that's better for the same or slightly more money. And that is the peril of build to rent, is that you're only as good as everybody else around you. And if they become better, people will move because people are fickle. And, you know, so I think space standards won't drive that. I think it'll just be down to how people use it. And if everybody's satisfied with I mean, it would always be better to provide slightly larger balconies. They are quite tight, but, you know, that's down to the developer really and the operator in terms of what drives their belief in who's going to rent from them. I think
you're making such an incredibly important point there, Richard. You know, this last business, the last point you were saying there, that about standards and things, and you know, 4 parking spaces is that's a wonderful analogy. Thank you for sort of. Is it time to say revisit whatever happened to Parkour Morris? You know, okay, time has moved on. We're in a different place now. But is there now? Are we now at that point of needing a form of Parkour Morris again that's going to help us look at this holistic view of what we want? Because Parkour Morris was all about, you know, sufficient space to do sufficient things. And then what about procurement, the way we procure these things? Because I read just recently, only in the last few weeks, that some figures were put out. One of our large house builders produced, I think it was 14,000 homes, making a profit of £66,000 per unit on that. That's an awful lot of money. Now, is there a different way of perhaps procuring social housing with a not-for-profit situation, it would take a whole rethink, so that that profit of 66,000 can go into actually the quality of the product that's being created. You know, I think that could is something that would need to be, and then, you know, a totally different sort of procurement structure, maybe using more direct labour organisations where people are properly employed. They haven't got to, well, they've got to make a profit, sort of, per se. They've got to actually cover them, their thing. But of course, the profit is in the payback to the community that you're building those properties for. You know, and
David,
then,
David, there's, in the social housing world, it's called surplus, not profit, and they have surpluses that they could put back into building better. But at the moment, they have got no other way of funding the numbers that they're requiring. You know, some of these organisations are being asked to do 10,000 homes in the next 5 years, which there's no land for it. Or it's not available to them at the cost. And the reason that is because the house builders that are doing it for a profit are buying the land up from underneath them. So there's a whole rethink there.
I'm talking about a completely, you're absolutely right, a whole rethink, but you know, no available land, let's take that. So whatever this new procurement model takes in, it would encompass the local authority, the land that's already owned by the local authority, that's controlled by the local authority. Maybe there's some sort of like compulsory purchase or just land use and permitted development if you're doing these things. There's a whole raft of things that can be put in there. So the land is there, whatever the cost is, if it's done on a not-for-profit, some of that can be then sold off into people that want to buy, want to own, different sort of models and things, and the use and the sort of surplus that comes back, put that back into the not-for-profit pot, so that, you know, if you find that you've got to do, say, development on a bit of land that's already owned by a local authority, you haven't got to buy the land. You set the build cost and putting it all together with a DLO, properly employed people, it's going to cost so much. Economists can work out how much of that property has got to, say, be sold off to those people that want to buy things and want to buy the property and whatever. So the whole thing works itself. The cost will then sort of work through the whole structure. It's a big piece of work, but if anyone wants to, you know, it's bigger than our thing. If anyone wants to do a not-for-profit, we don't have to make a profit. We're a registered charity. We just have to keep our head above the water. I'm happy to work with whoever, but let's make a competent sort of social strata that's producing the homes that we want, the numbers, and not making this 66 grand of profit on building rubbish, basically, you know.
Great, thank you, David. On that note, actually, you just mentioned economists, and we do have a question here for Tom, our economist on the panel. It was mentioned in your interview, obviously, about the increase in development since lockdown, and obviously that's a really interesting report I actually saw from that you had as well on that. Do you think the impact, though, of material and skill shortages are going to start impacting this? So we might see a bit of a boost, but is this now going to kind of put a stop to some of these developments that are in planning?
It's a very good question. I haven't seen any real kind of intelligence whether or not we are really being constrained by all the shortages in materials and also the shortages in labour. I think what we have seen is a gradual, a slow but steady gradual improvement in the planning pipeline in the residential sector since we came out of second lockdown, which is really positive, because it was we had a ended up having a very weak pipeline due to all of the political uncertainty due to Brexit in 2019, and then obviously COVID in 2020. And we're now at a position where we have, there's lots in the planning pipeline, there's lots of contracts being awarded, etc. I think the positive for me is that construction has continued at high levels pretty much throughout the whole of 2021. The residential sector, I think, returned to pre-COVID levels sometime kind of summer, autumn time from memory in terms of actual construction output, and is now slightly ahead of that, ahead of those levels. So, it appears that construction is continuing. Obviously, we've seen materials inflation of about 20%. Labour inflation hasn't really happened, according to the official data at least. But we do have about 40,000 construction vacancies, again, according to the official data at the moment. So I think, obviously, with inflation, you're building less for the same price. So intuitively, that is likely to be a thing. But I think it's very difficult to know whether or not at this stage, whether or not we will start seeing capacity constraints in construction, whereby there just isn't, either we don't have the materials or the labour to do it. But it is a distinct possibility given the recent situation in Ukraine and ongoing shortages. I expect the shortages to continue even before recent events over the course of 2022. That's, people that are much more knowledgeable about this than I am have basically will say, yeah, continuing situation.
Tom, Nick, would you have some input on that? Obviously, for the balconies point of view, you're dealing with materials all the time. How's Sapphire dealing with any shortages?
The points Tom makes are really valid, and I think one of the things we've definitely seen within our own business and with other companies like us, or even competing ones, is that the challenge of supply chain is so much bigger now than it was 2 years ago. Obvious to say, but a lot of the bathroom capacity, particularly in our case, we manufacture balconies ahead of time, and that buffer zone has been absolutely brilliant from our point of view. However, those have really been impacted with material shortages and certainly the price of it. The other thing, when you're working on bigger projects, projects spanning over multiple years, where you've got hundreds of units being delivered over quite a long period of time, actually working with people at the front end of the clients and so on to actually to look at the prices and what might happen with materials in terms of very difficult to do. So there's a lot more stocking materials in advance and purchasing of things which have been invested. But from a buying point of view, we're certainly seeing as well, people are becoming more and more interested in financial security, because the reality is that companies like us all over the construction industry are very much getting their margins compressed, like we've seen in the energy sector of companies not being able to increase their pricing, and the rate they're buying at decreasing. There's been lots of companies which have gone, and that's something we're starting to see buyers take more interest of, is financial securities, so that they know the companies they're dealing with on their schemes are going to give them that continuity, because they have got the war chest, if you like, to actually ride a storm, like we're seeing at the moment, unprecedented levels, sure, but that's certainly some of the differences we're seeing.
Nick, it's interesting because I deal with a lot of smaller organisations looking at MMC and so forth, and one of the things that's occurring is they're bidding for certain elements, and once they've actually, because of the procurement process takes several months to get the awarded contract, when they go back, the prices have gone up and they're almost on the breadline already. So I think you'll see a lot of smaller organisations suffer more because of these ripples through the economy, and these ripples will, you know, I think today I just spent, I think it was 168 pence a litre. You know, what's that going to do with the rest of it? You know, those ripples are going to come through, and then developers will be starting to say the affordability of this is this. So this is going to be a 2025, 2026 problem with stuff that's going through on the board at the moment. You know, I feel for anyone that's got a small business and trying to get a price and doing something on a fixed price at least.
Yeah, exactly. That's the fuel example is a good example, but the that obviously ends up going straight back to the pockets of all of us in that respect, because of the fact that they can put the price up instantly. The challenge you've got with construction side of things is there's obviously contracts which have been placed and signed up to a year, 2 years ago, which you still have to deliver now. And the problem with the likes of us, companies like ourselves, which are buying from many different places across the industry, is you're not passing those contracts all the way down. It's not like the construction industry, which got subcontract after subcontract in place. But ultimately, it's that squeeze point, as you say, Ernie, which is where that financial security comes into it, and that's why we're seeing those behaviours there, because people are starting to realise that, and to keep that continuity Tom was speaking about up with the base of what it has been. You need to be looking ahead. You need to be making sure that you're making intelligent decisions from an early point of view, and got the mechanisms to cope with that. As I mentioned, buffers in production and so on, but also the ability to actually react quickly, because there are material suppliers of metals and that sort of thing which will agree a price, but then suddenly back out the commitment they have made, and so on. And that's a very challenging situation for anyone. But it's not unique to us. It's on so many different products, as all of you be well aware.
Richard and Brendan, do you find you know, are you suffering from a skill shortage yourself?
I'll let Brendan go.
I mean, I think there's generally a skill shortage in construction, and I think with Brexit, a lot of the European skilled labour, you know, hasn't stuck around, and that's a real problem. We've turned our hopes, in a sense, towards the offsite industries as a way of both controlling the quality of production, but as also the supply chain, and better working conditions will hopefully attract more staff and more people to get involved. And you know, offsite really is a process of the digitization of construction. So it potentially can introduce a little bit of sexiness, as it were, into the construction sector, which it badly needs, and some cutting edge technology. So again, it's nascent, but it is growing. And I mean, if we look at how offsite has matured just in the last 5 years, where, you know, there were very few, and I make this point because it's really quite important, institutional grade suppliers, say Tide Construction really being one, who did the Croydon Tower. Now there's more coming up that have that effectively that covenant. But I think there's another threat, and I don't want to be a doomsday here, but we can't look at this without looking at climate change, because whilst the Ukraine situation is awful, it will have a massive short-term effect, perhaps even a very long-term effect. Climate change and the accounting principles which were discussed and largely agreed at COP26 are going to have a profound influence on our industry, what we specify for our buildings and where it comes from. The whole embedded carbon issue is going to be profoundly disruptive to how we approach the design and delivery of buildings. And there's even talk about, if you want to go to net carbon, you can prove your building is zero carbon in use. It's not going to count, because you have to factor in the embedded carbon that created that platform, if you like. So, I mean, Tom, you'll probably have some thoughts on this, but that, you know, that means that the entire industry is going to have to rethink, not just the small guys, which I agree with you, Ernie, they are having a terribly tough time. As an industry, there's levels of dysfunction. I think we'll accept that, and we need to collaborate more. And I think this is a point of the book. collaboration is going to help us sort these, I don't know what those solutions are for all of them, but that's a good start, is to collaborate closer, more frequently, and on all issues.
It's quite an interesting point you made there, Brendan. I was a future builder, like many people would have been probably on this this discussion, but the fact is there's 4 new regulations which are coming out, PLOS as it's being referred to, Part F, Part L, Part O, and Part S. That's quite a substantial amount of change, and this is all on top of all the fire regulations and the substantial direction change we've seen that kind of lead on to in terms of being part of things, and digitalisation is, as you say, but it's something we can't close our eyes to. It's coming right now, isn't it, in many ways, shapes, and forms.
Yeah, I think, Brendan preaching to the converted over here, I think, but I think bring it back to the kind of it's about culture, isn't it? And it's about, if it was me, if I was the chief executive of a either manufacturing company going to construction or a contractor, I would be driving the ESG agenda throughout my whole business, starting from the top in terms of risk board level risk management framework, all the way down through how I make decisions in terms of what do I buy product wise, what do I decide in terms of what I construct or what I want to build, so I can understand that long-term whole life environmental, carbon, social cost, so that I can make effective decisions. And I need to be able to understand what's going to happen in the future, because I don't know if the price of structural steel is going to spike by 200% in the next week because of geopolitical issues or whatever. The great kind of moderation is over, and I think it's about taking responsibility as an industry and as a company, and it starts close to home, doesn't it, really? And I think more and more you see that the short-term, purely profit motive-based decisions come back to bite you in 1, 2, 3, 5 years, whereas you can only really, you benefit from the long term by making those better decisions that take a wider criteria into account. So sorry, got on a soapbox there for a minute, but
I think you're 100% right though. The buck's passing stops now. We're at that end of the issue, and we can't afford to keep passing it on. It needs to be resolved now, and that has to factor through everybody involved in this industry. I can't remember what percentage of carbon we contribute. It's over 20%, I think, as an industry, and we need to get a grip on it and make changes now, because if only if I was a build to rent operator, I know from my kids, as I said in my interview, they blame me for the situation we're in. My entire generation is at fault, no one else is, but they're not wrong to a certain degree, and they're becoming more savvy to the requirements of the environment, and they will be the next generation of renters, and they'll educate the next generation of renters. And if we've not provided buildings that can meet those requirements now, they're not going to be in use. There'll be completely different things in the future. So we have to start now.
That's great. Thank you, guys. I think, I say, like Nick, I attended Future Build, and there's some really interesting presentations on there, particularly one that we watched about the study of buildings from start to finish and then in residency, and actually buildings that we're building, saying that we're doing everything we can with materials and how we're building it. But actually, when it came to the residents living in the buildings, they were finding problems with the accommodation getting too hot in the summer, or the thermal breaks not working as well. So it was having heat loss on things like that. So what do you guys think there's been enough done on that kind of research to actually make sure that these buildings that we're in good intentions are trying to make, the carbon savings and everything and meet the requirements, actually when it comes to people living in them, are they actually delivering?
It comes down to money again, because a lot of the research hasn't been done. There was a really good thing up in Sheffield. Number of houses were being monitored for a number of years, and then they just dropped off the radar. All the data was still being logged, but there was no one doing anything with it. We haven't done enough, but it's a bit like in the aircraft industry. If something goes wrong, they have a duty of care to tell everyone, because things fall out the air. In the construction industry, we sweep it under the carpet, don't tell everyone. And that's where, if we had a more open and honest issue with regards to this product doesn't work or this detail doesn't work, then it may be a lot easier to resolve.
But only, I mean, sorry.
Sorry, I was just, the only reason I mentioned that is because, you know, I spent an awful long while working at BA in the 90s, and it was, you know, every little nut and bolt was covered.
But it's a cultural point, isn't it? And I think that as an industry, construction, and particularly residential construction, has not measured its buildings or recorded them much at all. And I think if you look at other sectors and other businesses, they are measuring performance. They're looking at outcome-based decision-making processes, and they measure and report on that. And in construction, and particularly residential construction, it's pretty absent. Now, if we look at the ESG agenda at the moment, the E is getting most of the support. We understand at least how to measure that and how to design for that to some extent, but the S is very unoxygenated. Social impact is not really understood by our industry, but in fact, we're creating products that are having a massive impact on the residents and the occupants and the workers in those buildings. I mean, if you go and buy a pair of shoes from Clark's, they are concerned about the impact of those shoes on your life. And if it goes wrong, they want to know about it. I mean, and that's a pair of shoes. So, you know, I think our industry needs to measure social impact. I know a number of occasions where simple things like glare have caused massive amounts of grumpiness for occupants in their home, because there's too much light, and the blinds were VE'd out as part of the the economizing of the job. But the impact on the mental health of those residents for that small item was big, and they didn't have the resources to fix that quickly. We need to, the S in ESG is where we make our biggest contribution to the world, really. Carbon is very, very important, and reducing carbon, of course, is all of our responsibilities. But in the construction industry, our products matter to people, and we need to measure that. We need to measure that more and more and report on it. And we mustn't be scared that we start at zero, because one step is an improvement. Just 1 degree is an improvement. And I think we'll all be starting at zero, but we must start to measure and report on what we're doing.
Such an important point, Brendan, that I've had this argument with building control and the LABC, and also the approved inspector type of thing, that it all comes together when we look at the CDM and the regulations. Building Regulation 7, it's actually unique, and I don't think the importance has been given of Building Regulation 7. It's just very, very small. It's about materials, the product, and it's about the workmanship being appropriate and suitable for the job. It's the only regulation that's got its own, and we've heard these words, the approved documents and things. It's the only regulation that's got a single regulation around which an approved document has been written. And when you actually see these, can I call them Muppets, going through the Grenfell inquiry at the moment, when they're asked what is actually Regulation 7 about and the guidance of the approved documents, there's very little understanding of that. And for me, this holistic approach of Regulation 7 brings it together. It's the ley line point where materials and workmanship meet. And when I've said this to local authority approved inspectors, LABC, that you need to be ensuring that Regulation 7 is complied with, and they said, David, If we had to do that, we wouldn't get through the volume of work that we've got. And where are we going to find the competence to actually police the appropriateness and whatever around the sort of competence to do Regulation 7? This is where I think has gone wrong, this needing to prescriptively apply guidance, which is guidance is guidance. It's only guidance. A competent person only probably needs to have a cognizant appreciation of guidance and make their own view as to whether they're going to do a safe design or whatever design in some other way, and be prepared to stand up and defend that some other way. It's we're missing something here with this sort of appropriateness of materials, selection of materials, competence, workmanship, and all of that. I think this prescriptive, okay, apply the 80-20. It might, and in fact, the guidance says, if you follow this guidance, it's probably written to help you achieve the bulk of the ordinary work. But when something goes into that other stage, the 20%, if you're working on the 80-20 or the 70-30, and it goes into the 30 or the 15% or whatever the risk area is, if it all fits into that, and all the designers have prescriptively missed the fundamental points in their design that they need to cover in terms to look at Regulation 7, you get the perfect storm, and those trusting innocents that trust what's being designed for them, they have no other option. They have to trust. They've got to live in these places, and we let them down. So Regulation 7, this whole business of appropriateness and understanding and ensuring that the right materials are in the right place for the right job, I think is so important. So yeah, just thought throw that in.
Thank you, David. So thank you very much to all of the panel. We have really come towards the end of the discussion today. It's amazing how quickly an hour can go when everyone's really interested in the topic. If I could just get a quick closing thought from everybody. So one kind of take home for what basically creating a successful vision means to them. So Brendan, I was wondering if you could go first.
I mean, to me, there's two major considerations. First of all is, who is your customer? Who are you designing for really? And the other one is the planet. So a macro and a micro, but those are the major considerations.
Thank you, Brendan. And Tom.
Yeah, I think so. I guess the long-term view, understand the risks in that, and try to take as many different facets of people with different views into that decision-making framework to allow the best kind of mix of outcomes there. Because if you're taking, trying to take a decision from a narrow viewpoint, you're likely to get a very skewed outcome.
Thank you, Tom. And Richard.
Well, second Brendan's planet. And the idea of considering the wider community, which I think is a bit of what Tom has just said as well for me.
Lovely, thank you. Nick?
My thoughts, Kelly, was that we can't be thinking isolation in individual corners. The whole purpose of the ResiBuild book, for those of you who haven't seen it, the external envelope vision, was about creating balance and getting the right people in the mix. And I know a number of people contributed to this anyway, but it is back to that balance point, I think, and it's creating an understanding how one aspect affects another bit, which is so important on that. So certainly I don't like your book there, Kelly, in terms of actually having a read at it, and if anyone wants to access it, it's on the ResiBuild website, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah, thank you. And David?
Yes, the key takeaway from this is Well, actually, it's all in the book anyway. Yes.
Yes.
Great book. Great book. You know, strive to understand the industry. Strive to understand. And the point you were saying, Brendan, understand who your clients are. Who understand who you're designing for, and then, as an industry, let's strive to be understood. You know what we're actually doing. So this is for me. And Nick, what Sapphire, you know, we had a visit. Thank you for the visit. Our board visited your headquarters to have a look at your wonderful sort of operation. You know, for the rest of time, what person screwed up that particular bolt on a particular day to a particular talk for that particular person that's got to stand on that balcony, and etc., etc. So understanding that holistic view of where you are, that it's not just a plethora of bits of material that's been pulled in from anywhere and thrown together to do it. I think you're, as it says, it's the external envelope vision, the way you're doing it, the way you're procuring, the way you're training, the way you're managing the thing is visionary anyway, and it's exemplary. So that's my takeaway anyway, and I'm really pleased to be on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And finally, Ernie.
The planet, because I've got a few children that I want to make sure that they've got something left for. The other thing is, I think we should all, as designers, look at when you're designing something, and are you prepared to either live in it or pay for it? Yeah. Then it focuses your mind.
That's great. Thank you, Ernie. So yes, I'd like to thank all of the panel for your time today and on your interviews. It's been great to have you here and sharing your experiences and your knowledge. Thank you to all of the people that have viewed today, whether you've joined us on Zoom or you're watching us on our ResiBuild platform. It's been great to have you here, and I hope we've met what we set out to do, kind of thing. If you did have any further questions, like I say, we did have a couple of questions we didn't get time to cover, so I will try to get those answered for you, and we'll add that to the page probably next week.
There's a few on the chat as well, Kelly.
Yeah, I saw a few of those as well. It's like, I think we all had, it was great to have a lot of interaction there, and people were obviously very interested in what you guys were saying, so thank you very much. And if you do go onto the ResiBuild website, like I said, this is a series of events based on the books, so we will be having our next event, Delivering the Vision, and that will be taking place in June, so do get online and register for that one. We're also hosting our next live event on the 25th of May, and that will be at the Guinness Storehouse in Dublin, so be looking at construction in Dublin. So again, more information about that is on the ResiBuild website. And like Nick said, if anyone's interested in the book and they've not got a copy of it yet, again, all the information is on the ResiBuild website on how you can actually get out and get a copy. I would highly recommend it, and as you can see from David's copy, it's all got little bookmarkers and everything in it, so obviously there's quite a lot of good content in there, so please do get on there and have a look about getting a copy. But yes, I noticed that. So thank you everyone again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.